The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hermann Hospital cast harsh shadows across the empty corridors as Sarah Mitchell walked slowly toward the parking garage. Her white nursing shoes squeaked against the polished linoleum floor, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat over the past 8 years. But tonight, that sound felt different, final somehow. It was 11:47 p.m. on a cold February evening in Houston, Texas. The city that never seemed to sleep was unusually quiet, as if even the urban chaos understood that some moments required silence. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, not because of the Texas winter chill, but because of the emptiness that had settled deep in her bones over the past 6 months. 6 months since the phone call that changed everything. 6 months since Officer David Rodriguez had knocked on her door with news that would shatter her world into a million irreparable pieces. Her husband, Michael Mitchell, had been killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver on Interstate 45. The other driver walked away with minor injuries. Michael, who had been coming home from his night shift at the oil refinery, never made it past the Galveston County line. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her car keys. The Honda Civic that Michael had surprised her with for their 5th wedding anniversary sat alone under the dim parking garage light. She remembered how proud he had been, how he had worked double shifts for 3 months to afford the down payment. "Every nurse needs reliable transportation," he had said, his green eyes twinkling with that mischievous smile she fell in love with in college. The car still smelled faintly of his cologne, a woody scent she had bought him last Christmas. She had tried everything to remove it: air fresheners, professional cleaning, even leaving the windows down during Houston's humid summers. But somehow, that trace of Michael refused to leave, as if the car itself was mourning his absence. As Sarah sat in the driver's seat, staring at the concrete wall in front of her, the weight of her decision pressed down on her chest like a physical force. She had thought about this moment for weeks now. The planning had been methodical, clinical even, a trait that served her well in the intensive care unit but felt cold and foreign when applied to her own life. Tonight felt different from all the other nights when the thought had crossed her mind. Tonight, she had said goodbye to her patients with extra care, stayed late to help Jennifer Thompson, the new nurse, with her charting, and even cleaned out her locker. Small acts that no one would think twice about, but that felt monumental to Sarah. She reached into her purse and pulled out the letter she had written to her sister, Rebecca Davis, who lived in Austin with her 2 young children. Rebecca had been calling every day since the funeral, begging Sarah to come stay with them, to take some time off work, to see a therapist. But Sarah couldn't explain to her sister that the pain wasn't something that could be fixed with time or professional help. It was a physical presence now, a darkness that followed her everywhere she went. The letter was simple, apologetic, and she hoped sufficient to help Rebecca understand that this wasn't her fault. Sarah had sealed it carefully and left it on her kitchen counter next to the photo of her and Michael from their honeymoon in Galveston. They looked so young in that picture, so full of hope and dreams that would never come to pass. As she started the engine, the radio came to life automatically. It was tuned to Kilt 100, 3 FM, Houston's country station, Michael's favorite. He used to joke that country music told the story of real people living real lives, not the manufactured emotions of pop music. Sarah had grown to love it too, finding comfort in the storytelling and the twangy melodies that seemed to understand heartbreak in a way that other genres didn't. But tonight, as she prepared to drive to the bridge she had chosen, a quiet overpass on the outskirts of the city where she was unlikely to hurt anyone else, the music felt like mockery. How could songs about love and loss and redemption exist in a world where good people like Michael died while drunk drivers lived? She was about to turn off the radio when the opening guitar riff of a familiar song began to play. The DJ's voice had introduced it as a classic from the king of country himself, George Strait. But Sarah barely registered the words. What she heard instead was the gentle, honest voice that had become a soundtrack to her marriage. I cross my heart and promise to give all I've got to give to make all your dreams come true. In all the world, you'll never find a love as true as mine. The song was I Cross My Heart, and suddenly Sarah was transported back to September 15th, 2018, her wedding day. She and Michael had chosen this song for their first dance, swaying together in the community center in her hometown of Beaumont, while their families and friends watched with tears in their eyes. Michael had whispered the words in her ear as they danced, his voice slightly off-key, but filled with such sincere emotion that Sarah had felt like she was melting into him. "You will always be the miracle that makes my life complete," George Strait's voice continued, "and as long as there's a breath in me, I'll make yours just as sweet." The memory hit Sarah like a physical blow. She could almost feel Michael's arms around her, smell his aftershave, hear his slightly nervous laughter as he tried to keep up with the rhythm. He had practiced that dance for weeks in their tiny apartment, stepping on her toes and apologizing profusely until she finally convinced him that she didn't care if he was Fred Astaire, she just wanted to dance with him. That night, after the reception, they had driven to Galveston Beach and walked along the shore in their wedding clothes, talking about their future. Michael had big dreams. He wanted to save enough money to buy a little house with a yard where they could raise children, maybe get a dog, plant a garden. Simple dreams, but they had felt as vast and possible as the Texas sky above them. "And as long as there's a breath in me, I'll make yours just as sweet." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she sat in the parking garage, tears streaming down her face. Michael had kept that promise right up until his last breath. Even in their final phone conversation on the night he died, he had asked about her day, reminded her to eat dinner, told her he loved her and couldn't wait to see her when he got home. But what struck Sarah most profoundly in that moment wasn't just the memory of their wedding dance, but the realization that Michael's breath was gone. But hers wasn't. She was still breathing, still alive, still capable of making choices. And suddenly, the choice she had been so certain about moments before seemed less like destiny and more like betrayal. As the song continued to play, Sarah found herself remembering other moments when George Strait's music had been the backdrop to her life with Michael. Amarillo Morning, playing on their first road trip together to visit his family in Dallas. Check Yes or No, coming through the speakers at the honky-tonk bar where Michael had proposed, getting down on one knee right there on the dance floor while couples two-stepped around them. The Chair had been playing in their kitchen the morning she told him she was ready to start trying for children, a conversation that now would never lead to the family they had dreamed of. George Strait's music hadn't just been entertainment in their relationship, it had been a witness to their love story. And now, as Sarah sat alone in her car, contemplating the end of her own story, that same voice was asking her to remember that love stories don't end with death. They transform. The song was nearing its end, and Sarah realized she had been holding her breath. As George Strait sang the final lines, "I cross my heart," she took a deep, shaking breath and made a different choice than the one she had planned. Instead of driving toward the bridge, Sarah drove home to her small apartment in the Montrose neighborhood. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom place with thin walls and neighbors who played music too loud, but it was filled with memories of Michael. His coffee mug was still in the sink, where he had left it that final morning. His work boots sat by the door, muddy and worn from years of honest labor. His half of the closet remained exactly as he had left it, because Sarah couldn't bear to pack away the physical evidence of his existence. That night, for the first time since the funeral, Sarah allowed herself to truly grieve. She cried for the future they would never have, for the children they would never raise together, for the growing old together that had been stolen from them. But she also cried with gratitude, gratitude that she had been loved so completely, that she had experienced a love worth grieving, and that somehow, through a song on the radio, Michael had reminded her that her story wasn't over yet. As dawn broke over Houston, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Sarah of Michael's favorite sunrises, she made a cup of coffee using his mug and sat down to write a different kind of letter. This one wasn't an apology or a goodbye. This one was a thank you note to a man she had never met, but who had somehow saved her life in a parking garage at 11:47 p.m. on a cold February night. The letter began simply, "Dear Mr. Strait, you saved my life last night, and I think you should know what you did." 3 months had passed since that night in the parking garage, and Sarah Mitchell's life had begun to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't the comfortable, predictable rhythm she had shared with Michael, but it was a rhythm nonetheless. One beat at a time, one day at a time, one breath at a time. She had returned to work at Memorial Hermann Hospital the following Monday, much to the relief of her supervisor, Patricia Williams, and her colleagues who had been covering her shifts. But something had changed in Sarah during those dark hours in her car. The mechanical efficiency with which she had once approached her nursing duties had been replaced by something deeper, more intentional. "Sarah, could you take room 314? Patricia asked during the morning shift change in early May. "Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez is back again, 4th time this month. Her family is, well, they're having a hard time accepting the prognosis." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. Eleanor Rodriguez was 83 years old, suffering from end-stage heart failure. Her family, 3 grown children and numerous grandchildren, had been alternating between denial and bargaining with God, demanding that the medical team do something, anything, to extend their matriarch's life. As Sarah entered room 314, she found Eleanor awake, staring out the window at the Houston skyline. Her weathered hands rested on top of the white hospital blanket, and despite the oxygen cannula in her nose and the various monitors beeping around her bed, there was a peaceful dignity about her that reminded Sarah of her own grandmother. "Good morning, Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah said softly, checking the monitors and adjusting Eleanor's pillows. "How are you feeling today?" Eleanor turned her head slowly, her brown eyes still sharp despite her illness. "I've been better, dear," she replied with a slight smile, "but I've also been worse. The doctor says my children are giving you all a hard time." Sarah paused in her chart documentation. The old Sarah would have given a diplomatic, professional response about family concerns being natural. But the Sarah who had sat in a parking garage and chosen life over death had learned something about the importance of honest conversation. "They love you very much," Sarah said, pulling up a chair beside Eleanor's bed. "Sometimes love makes it hard to let go, even when letting go might be the most loving thing to do." Eleanor studied Sarah's face with the keen perception that comes with age and approaching death. "You understand about letting go, don't you, dear? You have that look. The look of someone who has stared into the darkness and chosen the light." The accuracy of Eleanor's assessment caught Sarah off guard. In her professional role, she was accustomed to being the one who provided comfort and insight, not the one who received it. But there was something about Eleanor's gentle directness that invited honesty. "I lost my husband 6 months ago," Sarah found herself saying. "For a while, I thought the only way to stop the pain was to stop breathing. But someone reminded me that as long as there's breath in me, I have choices to make." Eleanor reached out and took Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Music," she said simply. "It was music, wasn't it? That's what saved you." Sarah's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Because music saved me too, dear. Not from death. That's coming whether I want it or not. but from dying with regret and bitterness. Eleanor's grip tightened. My husband Roberto died 15 years ago, cancer. Toward the end, he was in so much pain, and I was so angry at God, at the doctors, at Roberto himself for leaving me. The night before he died, the radio in his room was playing an old song, El Rey, by José Alfredo Jiménez. Roberto loved that song, used to sing it when he worked in the garden. Eleanor paused, gathering strength to continue. As that song played, I watched Roberto's face change. The pain seemed to lift, just for those few minutes, and he looked at me with such love, such gratitude for our 47 years together. He died the next morning, but he died at peace, and so did I. That's when I learned that music doesn't just entertain us. It reminds us who we are and who we love. The conversation with Eleanor stayed with Sarah throughout the day. As she went about her duties, administering medications, updating charts, conferring with doctors, she found herself listening more carefully to the sounds around her. The steady beep of heart monitors became a rhythm. The soft conversations between family members in waiting rooms became melodies, and the quiet humming of a housekeeping staff member became a song of service. That evening, as Sarah drove home through Houston's notorious traffic, she found herself thinking about the letter she had written to George Strait 3 months ago. It remained unsealed in her desk drawer at home, read and reread dozens of times, but never sent. Part of her worried that it would seem foolish or overly dramatic to a man who probably received thousands of fan letters. But Eleanor's story had reminded her that sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we think we don't have the right to have. Instead of going straight home to her apartment, Sarah made a detour to Fitzgerald's, a small music venue in the Heights neighborhood where she and Michael used to go for their monthly date nights. It was a Tuesday evening, so the crowd was sparse, mostly locals who came for the laid-back atmosphere and the decent bar food. Behind the bar, Sarah recognized Tommy Ferguson, a guy in his 50s who had been serving drinks there for as long as she could remember. Tommy had the kind of weathered face that spoke of a life lived fully, with laugh lines around his eyes and graying temples that gave him a distinguished look despite his casual attire. "Sarah Mitchell," Tommy said with genuine warmth as she approached the bar. "I haven't seen you since before. How are you holding up, honey?" Sarah appreciated that Tommy didn't dance around Michael's death or offer empty platitudes. "I'm learning how to hold up," she replied. "Some days are better than others." Tommy nodded and poured her a glass of wine without being asked, a Pinot Grigio, her usual. "I remember you and Michael sitting right over there." He gestured to a small table near the stage, arguing about whether Garth Brooks or George Strait was the better artist. Michael was Team Garth, if I recall correctly. "And I was Team George Strait," Sarah smiled, the memory bringing warmth instead of pain for the first time. "Michael used to say Garth had more energy, but I always thought George had more soul." "Smart woman," Tommy chuckled. "George Strait's music has gotten me through more heartbreaks than I care to count. There's something about his voice. It's like he's lived every song he sings." As if summoned by their conversation, the opening notes of Amarillo Morning began playing through the venue's sound system. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied memories of Michael, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a sense of connection to the countless other people who had found comfort in these same songs. "Tommy," Sarah said impulsively, "do you think it's crazy to write a letter to someone you've never met, thanking them for something they don't even know they did?" Tommy leaned against the bar, giving her his full attention. "Honey, I've been tending bar for 27 years. I've heard every kind of story you can imagine, and I've learned that the only crazy thing is keeping gratitude locked up inside when you could share it with the world." He paused, wiping down a glass with practiced efficiency. "Besides, you never know what impact a simple thank you might have on someone else's life." I've got a whole box of letters and cards from customers who took the time to tell me that this place, or a conversation we had, meant something to them. On the hard days, I read those letters and remember why I do what I do. That night, Sarah drove home with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She pulled the letter to George Strait from her desk drawer and read it one more time. "Dear Mr. Strait, you saved my life last night, and I think you should know what you did. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a nurse at Memorial Hermann Hospital in Houston. 6 months ago, my husband Michael was killed by a drunk driver, and last night I had decided that the pain of living without him was more than I could bear. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage, preparing to drive to a bridge where I planned to end my life, when your song, 'I Cross My Heart,' came on the radio. That was the song Michael and I danced to at our wedding, and as I listened to the words about promises and love lasting as long as there's breath in you, I realized that Michael's breath is gone, but mine isn't. And as long as I'm breathing, I have choices to make. I chose to come home instead of driving to that bridge. I chose to remember that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, and I chose to keep living, not just for Michael's memory, but for all the other lives I might touch as a nurse, as a friend, as someone who has learned that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone. Your music has been the soundtrack to the most important moments of my life. It was playing when Michael proposed, when we got married, during our road trips and quiet Sunday mornings. I don't know if you intended your songs to be medicine for broken hearts, but that's what they've become for me, and I suspect for thousands of other people. Thank you for your gift of music, and for reminding me that even when we can't see the light, it's still there, waiting for us to choose it. With deepest gratitude, Sarah Mitchell." This time, instead of returning the letter to the drawer, Sarah sealed the envelope and wrote George Strait's fan mail address on the front. She had looked it up months ago, thinking she would never have the courage to actually use it. But Eleanor Rodriguez's words about music, reminding us who we are, and Tommy Ferguson's encouragement about sharing gratitude, had given her the push she needed. The next morning, on her way to work, Sarah stopped at the post office and sent the letter on its way to Nashville, Tennessee. She had no expectation that George Strait would ever read it personally, let alone respond to it, but the act of sending it felt like a release, a way of honoring both her grief and her gratitude. What Sarah couldn't have known, as she walked back to her car that morning, was that her letter would arrive at MCA Nashville on the same day that George Strait was meeting with his management team about his upcoming tour schedule. Nor could she have predicted that Linda Hayes, the dedicated fan mail coordinator who had been reading and responding to George's letters for 15 years, would be so moved by Sarah's story that she would walk directly to George's dressing room after his show in Tulsa and ask if she could have 5 minutes of his time. But sometimes the most important events in our lives are set in motion by small acts of courage, like a nurse choosing to live instead of die, or choosing to write a letter to a stranger, or choosing to believe that gratitude shared has the power to change the world, one heart at a time. The tour bus rolled through the Oklahoma countryside as George Strait settled into his favorite chair, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Outside the tinted windows, wheat fields stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, the landscape as familiar and comforting as an old song. After 35 years in the music business, George had learned to find peace in these quiet moments between shows, when the roar of the crowd had faded and the highway became his companion. His team was scattered throughout the bus. His longtime manager, Frank Martinez, was on the phone with promoters about the upcoming shows in Texas, while his sound engineer, Jake Patterson, worked on his laptop making adjustments for tomorrow night's venue. The familiar hum of activity continued around him, but George's attention was focused on the manila envelope in his lap. Linda Hayes, his fan mail coordinator, had handed it to him after the show in Tulsa 3 nights ago. "George," she had said with an unusual urgency in her voice, "I've been reading your fan mail for 15 years, and I've never read anything quite like this. I think you need to see it." Linda was not one for dramatics. A former English teacher from Nashville, she approached fan mail with the same methodical care she had once applied to grading essays. She sorted through hundreds of letters each week, crafting thoughtful responses and occasionally flagging something particularly special for George's personal attention. But this was the first time she had interrupted his post-show routine to deliver a letter personally. George had tucked the envelope away that night, intending to read it when he had time to give it proper attention. That time had finally come as they traveled through the quiet hours toward San Antonio, his hometown, and the next stop on the tour. He opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter, written on simple notebook paper in the careful handwriting of someone accustomed to documentation and precision. As he read Sarah Mitchell's words, George felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy or professional appreciation for a fan's kind words. "You saved my life last night, and I think you should know what you did." George had received thousands of letters over the years telling him how his music had helped people through difficult times: divorce, job loss, military deployment, the death of parents. Country music, by its very nature, spoke to life's struggles and triumphs. But there was something in Sarah's direct honesty, in her clinical description of sitting in a hospital parking garage, contemplating suicide, that cut through the usual distance between performer and audience. As he continued reading about her husband Michael's death and their wedding dance to "I Cross My Heart," George found himself thinking about his own marriage to Norma, his high school sweetheart who had stood by him through the lean years when success seemed as distant as those Oklahoma stars outside his window. They had been married for 47 years now, and George couldn't imagine the devastation of losing her, especially so young and so suddenly. But what struck him most profoundly was Sarah's realization that, as long as there's breath in me, I have choices to make. Those words echoed something George had been grappling with himself lately, questions about purpose and legacy that had been weighing on his mind as he approached his 70th birthday. For the past few years, George had been having conversations with his wife and his team about retirement. He had accomplished more than he had ever dreamed possible: over 60 #1 hits, more than 70 million albums sold, induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame, and the respect of his peers and fans. He had proven that traditional country music could still find an audience in an increasingly pop-influenced industry. But lately, the grind of touring had felt more like obligation than passion. The buses, the hotels, the stages had begun to blur together in a way that made him question whether he was still making music because he loved it or simply because it was what he had always done. Some nights, as he looked out at audiences of thousands singing along to songs he had written decades ago, he wondered if he was just going through the motions. Sarah's letter reminded him that his songs weren't just entertainment. They were medicine, companionship, and sometimes, apparently, lifelines. The responsibility of that realization was both humbling and energizing. George folded the letter carefully and walked to the front of the bus, where Frank was finishing his phone call. Frank Martinez had been George's manager for 23 years, and their relationship had evolved from professional to deeply personal. Frank understood George's moods and motivations better than almost anyone outside his family. "Frank," George said, settling into the seat across from his manager, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer." Frank looked up from his phone, immediately alert to the serious tone in George's voice. "Shoot. Do you think I've lost touch with why I do this?" George handed him Sarah's letter. "I mean, really lost touch, not just the normal road weariness that comes with touring." Frank read the letter slowly, his expression growing more thoughtful with each paragraph. When he finished, He set it down and looked at George with the directness that had made their partnership so successful. "I think," Frank said carefully, "that you've been so focused on maintaining your standards and honoring your commitments that you've forgotten to pay attention to the impact you're having. This letter isn't unusual because you helped someone, George. It's unusual because someone took the time to tell you about it." Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. "How many Sarah Mitchells do you think are out there? How many people have found something in your music that helped them through the worst moments of their lives? We get letters every week from military families, from people dealing with illness, from kids who say your songs helped them understand their grandparents' values, but you never read them anymore." George realized Frank was right. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped reading fan mail, stopped paying attention to the individual faces in the crowd, stopped thinking about his music as anything more than a craft he had perfected over decades of practice. The business side of his career, the schedules, the contracts, the promotional appearances, had gradually overshadowed the personal connections that had drawn him to music in the first place. "I want to meet her," George said suddenly. "Sarah Mitchell. We're playing San Antonio tomorrow night, and Houston is what, 3 hours away? I want to meet the woman who wrote this letter." Frank raised an eyebrow. "George, you know we don't usually do personal meet and greets. Your policy has always been to maintain some distance." "My policy," George interrupted, "has been to hide behind professionalism instead of engaging with the people who make my career possible. This woman saved her own life, Frank, but she credits my music for giving her the strength to do it. The least I can do is thank her in person." Frank could see that George's mind was made up, and truthfully, he had been hoping for something to reignite his client's passion for performing. "I'll have Linda track down her contact information." "But George, what if she doesn't want to meet? What if this letter was her way of saying goodbye to that chapter of her life?" George considered this possibility, but something in Sarah's letter suggested otherwise. Her gratitude wasn't retrospective. It was active, forward-looking. She had written about choosing to keep living for all the other lives I might touch as a nurse, as a friend. That sounded like someone who understood the ongoing nature of healing and connection. "Then we'll respect that," George said. "But we'll ask." The next morning, Linda Hayes made a series of phone calls that eventually connected her with Memorial Hermann Hospital in Houston. After some initial confusion and several transfers, she found herself speaking with Patricia Williams, the nursing supervisor who confirmed that Sarah Mitchell was indeed employed there and would be working the day shift. "Is Sarah in some kind of trouble?" Patricia asked, her protective instincts for her staff immediately activated. "Oh no, nothing like that," Linda assured her. "Mr. Strait received a letter from Sarah and would like to thank her personally. Would it be possible for you to ask if she'd be interested in meeting him after his show tomorrow night in San Antonio?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "George Strait wants to meet Sarah? Our Sarah? The Sarah who's been walking around here humming his songs for the past 3 months? That would be the one," Linda laughed. "Should I take that as a yes?" When Patricia approached Sarah during her lunch break with news of the invitation, Sarah's first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by panic. She had never expected George Strait to actually read her letter, let alone respond to it. The idea of meeting him in person seemed as surreal as her darkest night in the parking garage had been. "I can't possibly," Sarah told Patricia, her hands shaking slightly as she held her sandwich. "What would I say to him? What if I just start crying? What if I make a fool of myself?" Patricia sat down across from Sarah in the hospital cafeteria, her expression kind but firm. "Sarah, 3 months ago you were in the darkest place a person can be, and you found your way back to the light. You've been a different person since then, more present with your patients, more engaged with your colleagues, more alive. If George Strait played a role in that transformation and wants to thank you for sharing your story, Don't you think you owe it to yourself to accept that recognition? That evening, Sarah called her sister Rebecca in Austin and told her about the invitation. Rebecca's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Are you kidding me? Of course you're going. I'm driving down to San Antonio to go with you. This is incredible, Sarah." "But what if?" Sarah began. "No what ifs," Rebecca interrupted. "You wrote that letter because you needed to acknowledge the role his music played in saving your life. Now he wants to acknowledge the role your letter played in reminding him why his music matters. It's a circle, Sarah. It's supposed to close." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that Rebecca was right. Meeting George Strait felt scary because it represented a full acknowledgement of how far she had traveled from that night in the parking garage. It would be a way of honoring not just George's music, but her own journey back to life. The next evening, as she drove toward San Antonio with Rebecca chattering excitedly in the passenger seat, Sarah found herself thinking about Michael. She knew he would have been so proud of her courage, both in choosing to live and in reaching out to thank someone who had unknowingly helped her make that choice. As the lights of San Antonio appeared on the horizon, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future. Not the distant future that still felt too overwhelming to contemplate, but the immediate future, the next few hours, the conversation she was about to have with a man whose music had become the soundtrack to her healing. Neither Sarah nor George could have predicted how that conversation would change both of their lives, reminding each of them that sometimes the most profound connections happen between strangers who recognize something essential in each other's stories. The AT&T Center in San Antonio was still buzzing with residual energy from George Strait's performance as the last fans made their way to the parking lots. It had been a vintage Strait show, 2 hours of classic hits delivered with the understated mastery that had made him the undisputed king of country music. But for George, standing in his dressing room, still wearing his signature cowboy hat and western shirt, the real reason for tonight's significance was waiting in the green room down the hall. Linda Hayes knocked softly on his door. "George, Sarah Mitchell and her sister are here. Are you ready?" George took a deep breath, feeling more nervous than he had before taking the stage. Performing for 20,000 people had become as natural as breathing after 4 decades in the business. But this conversation with one woman who had bared her soul in a letter felt monumentally important. "Send them in, Linda. And thank you for making this happen." Sarah Mitchell walked into the dressing room with her sister Rebecca by her side, both women visibly starstruck, but trying to maintain their composure. Sarah was smaller than George had imagined, with shoulder-length brown hair and the kind of gentle, intelligent eyes that he associated with people who spent their lives caring for others. She wore a simple blue dress that Rebecca had insisted she buy for the occasion, and she clutched a small purse in front of her like a shield. "Mrs. Mitchell," George said, standing and extending his hand, "I'm George Strait, and I am so very honored to meet you." The formality of his introduction seemed to put Sarah at ease slightly. "Mr. Strait," she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I can't believe you actually read my letter, let alone wanted to meet me. This is my sister, Rebecca Davis. She drove down from Austin because she said there was no way she was missing this." George shook Rebecca's hand warmly, then gestured for both women to sit on the comfortable couch that occupied one corner of his dressing room. Instead of sitting behind his dressing table, where he might have seemed like a celebrity granting an audience, George pulled up a chair so they could sit face to face as equals. "Sarah," he said, leaning forward slightly with his hands clasped, "I need you to know that your letter has been on my mind for 3 days straight. Linda tells me she's been reading my fan mail for 15 years, and she's never brought anything directly to me like that before." Sarah felt tears threatening already, but they were different tears than the ones she had been shedding for months. These were tears of recognition, of being seen and understood by someone who had never known she existed until 3 days ago. "I almost didn't send it," she admitted. "I wrote it the night after. Well, after the night your song saved my life, but it sat in my desk drawer for 3 months. I kept thinking you probably get thousands of letters from people telling you how your music helped them, and mine wouldn't be special." George's expression grew serious. "Sarah, may I ask you something personal? And please don't feel obligated to answer if it's too difficult." She nodded, though her grip on her purse tightened slightly. "When you were sitting in that parking garage, when you were at your lowest point, what was it specifically about I Cross My Heart that reached you? I mean, I wrote that song 25 years ago for a movie, and while I'm proud of it, I've never thought of it as having the power to do what it did for you." Sarah was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Rebecca reached over and squeezed her hand encouragingly. "It wasn't just the song," Sarah said finally. "It was the memory the song brought back. Michael and I danced to it at our wedding, and when I heard those words about keeping promises as long as there's breath in you, I realized that Michael's breath was gone, but mine wasn't, and that meant I still had choices to make." She paused, looking directly at George. "But here's what I need you to understand, Mr. Strait. It wasn't just that one song that saved me. It was the fact that your music had been woven through every important moment of my relationship with Michael. When I heard I Cross My Heart that night, I wasn't just hearing a song, I was hearing the soundtrack to the greatest love story of my life. And that reminded me that love stories don't end with death, they just change form." George felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than professional satisfaction. For years, he had thought of his role as an entertainer, someone who helped people forget their troubles for a few hours. But Sarah was describing something different. Music as a keeper of memories, a guardian of love stories, a bridge between past and present. "Can I tell you something?" George said, his voice softer than it had been moments before. "For the past couple of years, I've been thinking about retirement. Not because I don't love music anymore, but because I started wondering if I was just going through the motions. The business side of this career can make you forget why you started singing in the first place." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the San Antonio skyline. "But your letter reminded me that I'm not just singing songs up there on stage. I'm holding space for people's memories, their love stories, their most important moments. That's not a responsibility I should take lightly, and it's definitely not something I should walk away from while I still have breath in me." Rebecca, who had been listening quietly, spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Strait, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but Sarah's not the only one your music has helped in our family. When our parents divorced when we were teenagers, and when our father died 5 years ago, and through every major transition in our lives, your songs have been there. Sarah might have written the letter, but she was speaking for a lot of us." George turned back to face the sisters, and Sarah could see that her letter had affected him as profoundly as his music had affected her. There was a vulnerability in his expression that she suspected few people ever saw, a glimpse of the man behind the legend. "I've been doing this for 40 years, George said, sitting back down, "and I thought I understood what it meant to connect with an audience. But tonight, talking with you, I realize I've been thinking too small. It's not about connecting with an audience, it's about becoming part of people's lives, part of their stories, part of their healing." Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Strait, can I ask you something now?" "Of course. Do you really not know how many lives you've touched? I mean, beyond just entertaining people?" George considered her question seriously. "I know people enjoy the music, and I'm grateful for that. But honestly, Sarah, until your letter, I don't think I fully understood the deeper impact. I've been so focused on the craft of songwriting and performing that I haven't been paying attention to the lives those songs go on to live after I sing them." Then you need to start paying attention, Sarah said, with a directness that surprised even her. Because there are thousands of Sarah Mitchells out there. People who've danced to your songs at their weddings, who've played them at funerals, who've found comfort in them during deployments and divorces and diagnoses. You're not just a singer, Mr. Strait. You're a keeper of the soundtrack to people's lives. The room fell quiet for a moment, all three of them absorbing the weight of what had just been acknowledged. Finally, George spoke. Sarah, would you be willing to do something for me? Something that might seem a little unconventional? What do you mean? I want to invite you to be my guest at a few more shows on this tour, not as a fan, but as a reminder. I want you to help me remember what I'm really doing up there on stage. Sarah looked confused. I don't understand. I think, George said slowly, working through the idea as he spoke, that I need to start really seeing my audiences again, individual faces, individual stories, and I think having you there, knowing what my music has meant to your healing journey, would help me remember to look for the Sarah Mitchells in every crowd. Rebecca gasped. Are you serious? You want Sarah to travel with your tour? Just for a few shows, George clarified. I know you have a job and a life in Houston, but maybe just the Texas shows. Houston, Dallas, Austin. I could arrange for you to have time off, transportation, hotels, whatever you need. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer, but also by its implications. 3 months ago, she had been planning to end her life. Now George Strait was inviting her to be part of his tour, to help him rediscover his purpose as she had rediscovered hers. I would be honored, she said quietly. But I have one condition. Name it. I want to keep working as a nurse. That's who I am. That's how I serve the world. But if you really want me to help you remember why your music matters, then you need to come with me to the hospital sometime. You need to see what music means to people who are fighting for their lives every day. George extended his hand. Deal. As they shook hands, Sarah felt a completion of the circle that had begun in a parking garage 3 months ago. She had reached out to thank a stranger for unknowingly saving her life, and in doing so, she had reminded him why his life's work mattered. Now they were partners in a mission to honor the healing power of music and the connections that bind strangers together in the most unexpected ways. That night, as Sarah and Rebecca drove back to Houston, Sarah called into the radio station where it all began. When the DJ answered, she made a simple request. Could you play I Cross My Heart for everyone who's listening tonight? And could you tell them it's from a nurse who wants them to know that as long as there's breath in them, they have choices to make? The song played out over the Texas airwaves, reaching countless other drivers on dark highways, people working late shifts, insomniacs staring at ceilings, and maybe, just maybe, someone sitting in a parking garage somewhere, deciding between despair and hope. 2 months later, Memorial Hermann Hospital in Houston was experiencing something unprecedented in its 60-year history. Word had spread throughout the medical community that George Strait would be making a special visit to the cardiac intensive care unit. Not for a photo opportunity or publicity event, but to understand how music functioned as medicine in the daily lives of patients and healthcare workers. Sarah Mitchell stood at the nurses' station on the 4th floor, reviewing charts while keeping an eye on the elevator bank. She had worked closely with Patricia Williams and the hospital's administration to plan this visit, ensuring that patient privacy would be protected while still allowing George to witness the role music played in healing. Sarah, he's here, Patricia announced softly, gesturing toward the elevator where George Strait emerged, accompanied by Linda Hayes and a single security person. He wore simple jeans, a button-down shirt, and his signature cowboy hat, but had left behind the stage persona that commanded arenas. This was George the man, not George the performer. Over the past 2 months, Sarah had attended 4 of George's concerts in Texas, each time sitting in a special section he had arranged for her near the side of the stage. From that vantage point, she could see both the audience and George's face as he performed. What she witnessed was a gradual transformation in how he approached his music. Where once George had seemed to look over the heads of his audience, focusing on some distant point beyond the crowd, he now made direct eye contact with individual faces. Sarah watched him seek out couples dancing to "I Cross My Heart," elderly fans singing along to "Amarillo Morning," and young people discovering his music for the first time. She saw him pause between songs to really listen to the applause, to absorb the energy and gratitude flowing back to him from thousands of people whose lives his music had touched. "George," Sarah said, walking over to greet him, "welcome to Memorial Hermann. Thank you for doing this." "Thank you for inviting me," George replied, his voice carrying the same sincerity she had observed during their first meeting. "I've been thinking about this visit since the night we met. I realize I've spent 40 years singing about life without spending much time in the places where people fight for it every day." Patricia Williams joined them, her professional demeanor softened by obvious excitement about hosting such a distinguished visitor. "Mr. Strait, we're honored to have you here. Sarah has arranged for you to observe some of our music therapy sessions, and several patients have requested to meet you if you're comfortable with that." "More than comfortable," George assured her. "I'm here to learn." Their first stop was the pediatric wing, where music therapist Jennifer Chen was conducting a session with children ranging from 5 to 15 years old. The kids were in various stages of treatment for cancer, cardiac conditions, and other serious illnesses, but the music room was filled with laughter and singing. Sarah watched George's face as he observed Jennifer leading the children through a simplified version of Deep in the Heart of Texas, clapping their hands and stomping their feet with whatever energy their conditions allowed. An 8-year-old girl named Maria Rodriguez, who was receiving treatment for leukemia, noticed George first. "Are you a real cowboy?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. George knelt down to her eye level. "Well, I do wear a cowboy hat and sing cowboy songs. Does that count?" "My daddy plays your music in his truck," Maria said proudly. "He says you sing about Texas better than anybody. Your daddy sounds like a smart man," George replied. "What's your favorite song?" "Texas, because that's where I live and where I'm going to get better." The simplicity and certainty of Maria's statement hit George like a physical force. Here was a child facing one of life's greatest challenges, finding strength in a song about the place she called home. Her connection to his music wasn't about entertainment or even comfort. It was about identity, belonging, and hope. Jennifer Chen approached them. "Mr. Strait, Maria and the other children would love to hear you sing something if you're willing." George looked around the room at the expectant faces, some bald from chemotherapy, others pale from long hospital stays, all of them looking at him with the kind of pure anticipation that reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. "What would you like to hear?" he asked the group. "Amarillo Morning," several voices called out simultaneously. George began to sing a cappella, his voice filling the small room with the familiar melody that had become synonymous with Texas pride and the promise of new beginnings. The children joined in where they knew the words, and even those too weak to sing hummed along or clapped softly. As he sang about the yellow rose of Texas and the eyes like diamonds in the sky, George found himself thinking about the layers of meaning these simple words carried for these young patients. For them, Amarillo Morning wasn't just a song about a pretty day. It was a promise that mornings would keep coming, that Texas would still be here when they were strong enough to explore it again, that there was beauty waiting for them beyond the hospital walls. After the song ended, a 15-year-old boy named David Thompson, who was recovering from heart surgery, raised his hand tentatively. "Mr. Strait, Could I ask you something? Absolutely. Do you ever think about how your songs help people when they're scared? Because when they were getting me ready for surgery, a nurse hummed one of your songs, and it made me feel like everything was going to be okay. George looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. This was exactly what she had wanted him to see. The daily, practical ways his music functioned as medicine. David, George said, until very recently, I didn't think about that enough. But I'm learning that music doesn't just entertain people. It reminds them who they are, where they come from, and what they're fighting for. Thank you for teaching me that. Their next stop was the cardiac ICU, where Sarah introduced George to Eleanor Rodriguez, the elderly patient she had grown close to over the past few months. Eleanor's condition had stabilized enough for her to be alert and conversational, though she remained on continuous monitoring. Mrs. Rodriguez, Sarah said, I'd like you to meet someone special. This is George Strait. Eleanor's weathered face lit up with recognition and delight. Mr. Strait, Sarah told me about your letter and how your music saved her life. Did she tell you about how music saved mine too? George pulled up a chair beside Eleanor's bed, just as Sarah had done months earlier. She mentioned that you had a story about music helping you when your husband was dying. Would you share it with me? Eleanor recounted the story of Roberto's final night, when El Rey had played on the radio and transformed her husband's pain into peace. As she spoke, George found himself thinking about the countless hospital rooms across the country where his music had played during similar moments. Last conversations, final dances, peaceful passings. Music doesn't change the facts, Eleanor said with the wisdom that comes from 8 decades of living, but it changes how we experience them. Your songs reminded Roberto who he was, a man who loved his family, who worked hard, who lived with dignity. That's how he was able to die with dignity too. George spent the next hour visiting with patients throughout the hospital, each encounter deepening his understanding of music's role in healing. He met Sandra Williams, a 40-year-old mother of 3 who was recovering from a mastectomy, and said that the chair reminded her of dancing with her husband on their anniversary every year. He talked with James Patterson, a 70-year-old veteran whose PTSD symptoms were managed partly through music therapy that included several George Strait songs. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when they visited the neonatal intensive care unit. Sarah explained that they played soft country music for the premature babies, finding that the gentle rhythms and melodies seemed to stabilize their breathing and heart rates. The nurses say the babies seem to respond best to your ballads, Sarah told George, as they watched tiny infants in incubators, some barely 3 pounds, their little chests rising and falling to monitors, beeping in rhythm. There's something about the cadence of your voice that mimics a mother's heartbeat. George stood silently, watching these newest Texans fighting for their first breaths while his music played softly in the background. The full circle of what Sarah had shown him became crystal clear. His songs weren't just entertainment or even comfort. They were part of the fundamental rhythm of life itself, accompanying people from their first breath to their last, and every important moment in between. As they concluded the hospital visit, George gathered the medical staff who had participated in the tour. Standing in the same conference room where Sarah had once sat through mandatory training sessions while contemplating ending her life, George addressed the doctors, nurses, and therapists who had opened their workplace to him. I came here today thinking I was doing you a favor by visiting, George said, his voice heavy with emotion. But you've given me something far more valuable than I could ever give you. You've shown me that music isn't just my career, it's my calling, and that calling isn't to entertain people, but to be part of their healing, their celebrating, their remembering, and their hoping. He paused, looking around the room at faces that had dedicated their lives to healing others. Every night when I go on stage, I see 20,000 people, but until recently, I wasn't really seeing any of them. Sarah changed that by helping me understand that each person in that audience has a story, and my music has somehow become part of their story. That's not a responsibility I take lightly anymore. Dr. Michael Chang, the hospital's chief of staff, spoke for the group. Mr. Strait, what you've given us today is the reminder that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about hope, connection, and dignity. Your music provides all three. Thank you for taking the time to see how it works. That evening, George had dinner with Sarah and Rebecca at a quiet restaurant in Houston's Museum District. The conversation flowed easily now. The formal boundaries that had existed during their first meeting replaced by the comfortable familiarity of shared purpose. "Sarah," George said as they finished their meal, "I have something to tell you, and I hope you'll see it as good news." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "I've decided not to retire, at least not yet. Today convinced me that I still have work to do, songs to sing, stories to be part of, but I want to do it differently now. I want to be more intentional about connecting with people, about understanding the role my music plays in their lives." He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "I've also written something, and I'd like your permission to read it at my shows." Sarah looked puzzled as George unfolded what appeared to be a letter written in his own handwriting. "A few months ago," George read aloud, "I received a letter from a nurse in Houston named Sarah Mitchell. She told me that my music had saved her life during the darkest moment she had ever experienced. That letter saved my career because it reminded me why music matters." He continued reading, describing his hospital visit and what he had learned about music as medicine. The letter concluded with words that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "So, when you hear these songs tonight, remember that you're not just listening to music. You're participating in a healing tradition that connects all of us. And if you're going through a dark time, if you're sitting in your own parking garage somewhere, wondering if you have the strength to keep going, remember that as long as there's breath in you, you have choices to make. Choose hope, choose healing, choose to stay and see what tomorrow's song might bring." Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin. "You're really going to read that at your shows?" "If you'll let me. Your story isn't just yours anymore, Sarah. It belongs to everyone who needs to hear that music can be a lifeline, that strangers can save each other's lives without even knowing it, and that the choice to keep living is always available, even in our darkest moments." Sarah nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, she found her voice. "Michael would be so proud of what came from his favorite music." 6 months later, George Strait was named Country Music Association Entertainer of the Year for the record-breaking 6th time. In his acceptance speech, he thanked his band, his family, his fans, and a nurse from Houston who reminded me that music isn't just what we do, it's who we are for each other in our most important moments. Sarah watched the ceremony from her apartment, surrounded by her colleagues from the hospital who had become her chosen family. As George held up the award, she thought about the letter that had started it all, sealed and sent on a leap of faith that gratitude shared could change the world. The letter had traveled from Houston to Nashville and back again, but more importantly, it had traveled from despair to hope, from isolation to connection, from endings to new beginnings. In saving George Strait's sense of purpose, Sarah had completed her own healing journey, discovering that sometimes the most powerful medicine we can offer each other is simply the courage to say, "You saved my life, and I think you should know what you did." On her kitchen counter, next to the photo of her and Michael from their honeymoon, sat a framed letter, not the one she had sent to George Strait, but the one he had written back to her, thanking her for reminding him that as long as there's breath in any of us, we have choices to make. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those choices create ripples that heal the world, one song, one letter, one life at a time. The radio played softly in the background, tuned as always to Kilt 100. 3FM, where George Strait's music continued to provide the soundtrack for love stories being written, healing journeys being traveled, and lives being saved by strangers who would never know the impact of their kindness. In the end, that's what Sarah had learned in a parking garage on a cold February night. We are all connected by invisible threads of music, memory, and hope. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to follow those threads, they lead us exactly where we need to go.